conservatives and people who believe in the market tend to be, it also is what works best. For three reasons. First, it does a better job with incentives. So each of us, whether you believe in climate change or not, doesn't want to spend $1 more on gasoline or electricity or home heating than you have to, because you would rather save that money and take it to the bank and go to the movies and buy popcorn, right? That's what you want to do with your money, and so you have an incentive to find ways to be more energy efficient. The incentives are not that way for politicians. Politicians' primary incentive is to make sure they get credit for appearing to do good, even if what they do doesn't. And the most recent example is Governor Inslee last week announced that he was flip-flopping and opposing a liquid natural gas production plant in Washington state, despite the fact that it would replace fuels that created more air pollution and emit more CO2. And the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency says that the fuel from this liquid natural gas plant would actually reduce CO2 emissions. But the governor now opposes it because he says it's not enough. The reason he's doing that is because he wants to send a strong signal to the environmental community folks who support him. And sure enough, they all said, what a great job you're doing, Governor. This will probably end up increasing total CO2 emissions and increasing air pollution. But the signal is strong, and he has no incentive. His incentive, what he gets rewarded for, is looking good. What you and I get rewarded for is actually saving resources, because we save money, no matter whether we're worried about a particular environmental issue or not. Second, we all have the knowledge about what we can do in our lives to save resources. Some people can buy a Tesla. Some people can telecommute. Some people can carpool. Some people can find other ways to save gas. But for each of us, it's different, and only we know what works for us. There is no one-size-fits-all top-down solution for energy efficiency and for saving resources. You have that knowledge in a way that people in Olympia don't. But when government gets involved, they can't do a million little things. They can only do a few big things. And the example is that we passed, over a decade ago, green building standards, where we require all schools to be built to this green building requirement. And the state looked at the schools that were built to this green building requirement, and what they found was that 5 of the 9 schools that they looked at actually performed worse than average, used more energy than the average school. These are supposed to be the most energy efficient, these are supposed to be the best, and yet, right after they were built, they were already worse than the average school. Only 1 of the 9 was the best in the district. And the reason is, even when you call something green, it doesn't mean that it actually is, and that the people on the ground who know how to make buildings more energy efficient had already done that work and were already ahead of the one-size-fits-all standard. So the second reason that the market and personal incentives are better is because we have the knowledge to make them work. Lastly, we are accountable. Individuals are accountable because if I try something and it doesn't work, I pay a price. So I'm a beekeeper. And there's a lot of debates about why bee mortality is high right now. And let's say I have a theory that it's because of pesticides. So I take all my bees and I put them on an organic farm where they don't use pesticides. And then over winter, all of my hives die. Right? My theory was wrong, and I pay the price. I could do the same thing again next year, and when all my bees die again, I'm going to have to say, you know what, maybe there's something else going on here, because I directly feel the pain of my bad decisions. It doesn't matter whether my ideology is politically correct or not. It only matters whether it's accurate. So we feel that accountability. Too often, though, politicians, and especially people in state agencies, and I used to work at a state agency, don't feel the direct impact. They're not accountable for their failures. And I'll give one more example. So the governor, when he took office, when he was first elected, he created something called, he was using lean management, and he created Results Washington, and he set some targets for CO2 reduction in Washington state. And he promised that he was going to meet them, and he actually told an author who's a national expert on lean management, said, holding ourselves accountable for results to the citizens of Washington isn't politically expedient, but it clearly is the right thing to do. Except that he never held himself accountable. They had targets for CO2 reduction in a number of different areas, electric vehicle sales, and he had 9 of them. Last year, I pointed out that he was missing his targets on all 9. So you know what they did this year? They removed the targets. So then they put up this thing over here where you can't see it, but I can, where it said, combating climate change, it says in development, coming spring 2019. So they scrubbed the old ones and said, oh, we're developing new ones now. So since it said spring 2019, I was thinking recently, hey, I wonder whatever happened. I wonder if they actually released those. And what I saw was over here, where it no longer says combating climate change, it now says keeping the Columbia River healthy. So not only had he scrubbed the old targets that he'd missed, he's now scrubbed climate change as a goal completely from his own results Washington. Who holds him accountable for this? The governor just declared this session a victory in terms of climate change. Categorizes himself as a climate leader, even as behind the scenes he is hiding the failure of his own mistakes. Those 3 things make the free market a better way to help the environment. We have the incentives to do more with less and help the environment. We have the knowledge about how to do it. And if we make mistakes, we are held accountable. And if we do the right thing, we are rewarded for it. That's why, on a fundamental level, it is better. The question is, okay, Todd, that's cute. You can do all these little things, but can it scale? And what we see is that it absolutely can. This is a graph of carbon intensity of the U.S. economy. And what do you see? Carbon is going down. The United States does not have a carbon policy. We don't have a cap and trade system like Europe. We don't have a carbon tax. And yet it is constantly going down. And the reason is every company in America wants to try to find ways to do more with less, produce more with less energy. It scales. Many hands make light work, and a myriad of little things means that we will do better quietly for the environment over time, better than government and politicians. And with that as an introduction, I want to introduce our first speaker. So Serena Carlson. I first met Serena when I was working on a project related to hunting and promoting hunting. And we had a shooting event not too far away from here. And it was the first time I'd done, it was sporting clays. And so she was showing me, and we had I don't know, probably 50 people. And I think, you missed 2 all day? Yeah, maybe. I knew then to take her seriously. She is a former reporter, a communications director, and a public information officer for state agencies. She also works in the Washington State Legislature. In addition to being a great shot, she provides advice and counsel on government affairs, public outreach, communication issues, and political campaigns. She's worked closely with both state and federal agencies on coordinating message to public audiences. She holds a BA in journalism and a minor in political science from a local Bulldog-related university. Please welcome Serena Carlson.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the introduction, Todd. I appreciate that. As Todd stated, my name is Serena Carlson, for those of you in the room who do not know me. I own a public affairs firm here in town that I named after myself. It's called Carlson Strategic Communications. I do a lot of work with natural resource types of companies. I actually come from a background in the timber industry, and I have done a lot of work with companies like sawmills, loggers, large timber landowners, some mining companies that basically make their living from the sustainable use of natural resources. And so that's how I've kind of gotten into that as an industry segment. The work that I did with Todd was for kind of an interesting organization called Hunting Works for Washington. And that is kind of a loose conglomeration of businesses that exists to promote the idea that the hunting sports and the shooting sports actually have, in addition to all of the positive benefits that they have for wildlife, for habitat, for clean air, clean water, there's also an economic uptick that many businesses in the state of Washington see during hunting season that people don't think about. It could be the gas station or the grocery store, or some of the smaller communities during pheasant season or elk season will see kind of an economic uptick from hunting and shooting sports. And so Todd asked me here today to talk a little bit about kind of an interesting aspect of wildlife conservation that's referred to by its sponsor names, the Pittman-Robertson Act. The act itself is called the Federal Wildlife Restoration Funding Act, but I'm going to call it Pittman-Robertson or PR throughout the whole day, so just roll with me on the acronym there. And at its heart, essentially, forgive me, I've had a cold. I'm a little bit congested up here. At its heart, essentially, Pittman-Robertson is the legislative act that enables a federal excise tax on firearms and on ammunition to pay for wildlife conservation. So let me give you a little bit of history about that. In the early days, Pittman-Robertson was passed in 1937, and it was passed as a response to an issue that was happening kind of at the end of the Great Depression. You had people that were essentially very poor, and people were subsistence hunting because it was that or go hungry. So some of our most popular game species today, your white-tailed deer, your turkey, ducks, upland game birds, were declining precipitously because people were hunting them to live, essentially. So what happened was, in the 1900s, the firearms industry and the ammunition manufacturers looked at this decline and said, this is not a sustainable model for our customer base. What can we do to fix this? So what they did was they went to Congress and said, look, there is already an existing federal excise tax on long guns, rifles, and on ammunition. So instead of that excise tax going into the general fund the way that it has been, can we possibly just earmark that so that it goes to state fish and game agencies to manage this resource? The logic is that if hunters are paying this excise tax, hunters should be the ones to benefit from it. And Congress, in a rare moment of clarity, said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So Pittman-Robertson passed in 1937, and here's how it works. It's an 11% excise tax on long guns and ammunition, and a 10% excise tax on handguns that was added later. Archery equipment and arrow components were added in 1972. I don't know how they skated under it for that long, but they did. It is paid for by the manufacturers, the producers, and the importers of firearms and ammunition. I assure you, they pass the savings along to the customers, so we all end up paying that. But it applies to all commercial sales and imports, whether the purpose is hunting, sport shooting, or personal defense. And that's really, really an intelligent thing to have put in as a provision of Pittman-Robertson, because, at the time, in 1937, probably 90% of the firearms that were being sold to the general public were hunting firearms. And maybe 10% were being, people didn't, again, this is on the heels of the Great Depression, people didn't have a lot of money for sport shooting, target shooting. The emphasis on home defense wasn't what it is today, so that was maybe 10% of firearm sales. And what we've seen currently in 2019 is that those percentages have almost done a complete flip-flop. Maybe 10% of the firearms that are being sold today are being sold for hunting, and 90% are being sold for target shooting or home defense. So to not limit it by the style of firearm was actually an incredibly intelligent addition to the legislation. The funds are handled by the Department of the Treasury, who then turns it over to the Department of Interior. Interior funnels that back down to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Fish and Wildlife is the one that allocates it to the state fish and game agencies. How they do that is kind of a complicated formula, so bear with me for just 1 second. I'm going to consult my notes and make sure that I get this right. But essentially, so all of the manufacturers throughout the states pay into this, to Pittman-Robertson. They end up with this big pot of money over here. And Department of Interior takes $8 million off the top of that pot and sends that to fund what they call enhanced hunter education. And if you dig into what enhanced hunter education is, that's essentially that $8 million is going to fund maintenance and repairs on shooting ranges. So like enhanced hunter ed is going to be more, it's not basic hunter safety. It's you're going to be going out in the field, you're going to be shooting various types of rifles, shotguns, pistols, handguns, playing with archery equipment. Like it's more of a hands-on approach to hunter ed for people that have the basics already. So $8 million comes off the top of the Pittman-Robertson Fund for that. Another $3 million comes off the top. It's available for what they call cross-state projects. So like as an example, if the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game want to work on a joint project involving caribou habitat or something like that, that will be going back and forth on the state border, they can apply for funds out of that $3 million pot that comes off the top of the initial Pittman-Robertson investment. And then the handgun assessment, and remember earlier in the presentation I talked about there was a 10% tax on handguns. The handgun assessment specifically goes to pay for basic hunter education. That's the free one that you sign your 10-year-old kid up for, or your cousin. If you've ever wondered why that's free, this is why that's free, because somebody paid for it, but it was people purchasing handguns was what paid for it. So after those three pots, basic hunter ed, enhanced hunter ed, and state-to-state projects, after those three come off the top, you still have this pot of money. And this pot of money is split down the middle, 50-50. This 50% is allocated to the states based on their land mass, and this 50% is allocated to the states based on how many hunting licenses they sold. So the state fish and game agencies that are doing a better job of providing hunting opportunities or managing their wildlife stand to get more money from this pot because they sold more hunting licenses, because they provided more opportunity for the consumer, essentially. I'll fly through the next bit because it is complicated. So prior to receiving funds, states actually have to submit to the Secretary of Interior, okay, here's our plan for how we're going to spend the money. Once a plan's been approved by the Secretary of Interior, the state actually has to front all of the money for the project up front. So they actually, it's interesting that it's a reimbursement, but that's just the way that it's structured. So they pay for whatever project they want to use Pittman-Robertson funds for, and then they're reimbursed out of the actual Pittman-Robertson Fund up to 75% of the cost of whatever their project was. The remaining 25% is paid for through hunting license sales. So again, there's an incentive by the agencies to provide these opportunities for consumers to get outdoors and enjoy the resource, essentially. One extremely important aspect of Pittman-Robertson is that in order to access the funds, states have to guarantee that the funds from Pittman-Robertson and their state hunting license fees are going to go back into management of fish and game resources. Otherwise, they're not eligible for Pittman-Robertson funds. So a state couldn't say to the federal government, we're going to use this to restore some wildlife habitat, and then turn around and fund education or fix roads or do things that aren't very specifically wildlife related. It's a very important provision of Pittman-Robertson. It's one of the reasons that it's successful, is because the states have this money that they can reliably count on every year. So Pittman-Robertson was a good enough piece of legislation that there have been some additions to it. In 1950, there was the Dingell-Johnson Act, which is the Federal Sport Fishing Protection Act. It's essentially Dingell-Johnson, or what you'll hear referred to as DJ. It was basically just Pittman-Robertson for fishing gear. A 10% federal excise tax on fishing gear that then goes back into state fish and game agencies for providing more fish habitat or providing more public access for places that people can go to actually fish. It truly is it truly is Pittman-Robertson, but for fish. In 1972, we added archery and arrow components. And in 1984, there was another version of it that came around called Wallet Bro, again referred to by its sponsors. Wallet Bro was pushed by the boat manufacturers. And they essentially came to Congress and said, look, we see how Pittman-Robertson is working for the firearms guys. We kind of want to get in on this. You should take 10% of our federal excise tax and use it to specifically put towards the maintenance and operation and acquisition of boat launch and boater access sites. And again, this is great long-range planning if you're a manufacturer, because you want people to buy your product and then have a good experience at the boat launch so that they go more often and they take their friends, and their friends think that was fun, and their friends buy a boat, and then their friends' friends go and buy a boat. I mean, truly, this is the free market at work. This is companies protecting their customer base in a way that has a public benefit. So again, the combination of PR funds, DJ funds, and state licensing dollars makes up about 75% of the average state fish and game agency. Am I in trouble? Okay. Makes up about 75% of the average agency budget. So in March of 2018, the Interior Department distributed $1.1 billion nationwide for state wildlife agencies from PR and DJ alone. Remember that number, because I would need to talk about that in a second. Over $12 billion has been collected since 1939 for wildlife conservation through Pittman-Robertson alone. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. So let me talk a little bit about what Pittman-Robertson can fund, because it is very narrow in scope. Pittman-Robertson can pay for hunter education, hunter safety classes. It can pay for shooting range maintenance and operation. It can pay for archery ranges. It can pay for agency conservation efforts. So that could be wildlife surveys, that could be habitat restoration, that could be land acquisition even. The only thing that Pittman-Robertson really cannot pay for is enforcement. So for state fish and game agencies that have game wardens, they have to pay those out of licensing and fees, and they have to come up with that on their own. Pittman-Robertson does not pay for your game warden. But as far as public-private partnerships go, this is a great example of one, because this is what there's so much public benefit to all of this, and the public-private partnership between industry and the agency is what is able to make these things happen and keep them going. So there is an association of fish and wildlife agencies, which I did not know, and they meet regularly with firearm manufacturers, boat manufacturers, fishing gear manufacturers. They meet regularly with these guys to talk about recruitment and retention of hunters and shooters. And the reason that they do that is because the agencies have a vested interest in making sure that there are people out there enjoying the resource. Whether it's hunting wildlife, whether it's fishing wildlife, whether it's watchable wildlife, bird watching, hiking, the agencies don't get to exist without this major influx. And so it behooves not only the companies, but also the agencies to make sure that there is kind of a continued customer base of people that are out there enjoying the resource. So I do want to talk a little bit about hunter percentages. Has anybody in the room seen the statistic on what percentage of the U.S. population hunts? Do you want to hear it? It's really low. 5%. And when I see that statistic, I also see a lot of hand-wringing from people who say, not only is that 5% and it's really, really low, 5% is down 50% in the last 50 years. So people freak out that, in 2019, there's only 5% of us hunt. But the fact of the matter is that in 1970, that means only 10% of us hunted. So this is a problem that has been a problem for a very long time. So it's very cool to see the agencies and industry come together and work on a solution that has benefits for both the agency itself and the industries that are very closely tied with these resources. It's fundamental to what you may have heard referred to as the North American model of wildlife conservation. That's the pay-to-play model. It's the fact that the vast majority of conservation in North America is funded by hunters and anglers. There's a direct link between people who hunt and the resources that are needed to expand and enhance opportunities to hunt and shoot. It's fundamental. It's, again, user pay, public benefit, and it's extremely successful because the industries are willing to say, look, tax us, please, because what you're doing is you're helping us in the long run establish, maintain, and potentially grow our customer base in the future. So all that can do is expand conservation. All that can do is expand hunting opportunities and shooting opportunities. This model generates partnerships that result in the policies that will ensure that people have opportunities to hunt and fish and hike and ride ATVs and do what they enjoy doing now and in the future. So we've talked a lot about how Pittman-Robertson works, but I do want to talk a little bit about whether it does work. So since 1938, over $20.2 billion has been collected from manufacturers and made available to the states. That's huge. Interesting side note, I went looking for the numbers. This number is as of 2018. I went looking for the number for 2019, and I had to dig for a really long time to find the press release from Interior, and it was released in February. It actually was when Ryan Zinke was still the Secretary of Interior, which I think is why there was no press coverage of it, because I have my own opinion about the media's treatment of Secretary Zinke, but given the Zinke bias, I kind of wanted to leave him with my closing thought here as far as does it work. For those of you who can't read it, I will read it for you. It says, every time a firearm, fishing pole, hook, bullet, motorboat, or boat fuel is sold, part of that cost goes to fund conservation. The best way to increase funding for conservation and sportsman access is to increase the number of hunters and anglers in our woods and waters. The American conservation model has been replicated all over the world because it works. I can't say it better than he could. So with that, I am done, and I'll turn it back over to Todd.
So one of the things that I always say is that if it's not economically sustainable, it's not going to be environmentally sustainable. Because where you see the biggest problems in the environment in terms of funding, it is because government is not able to find the resources. When I worked at the Department of Natural Resources, if you look at the problem with fish culverts, it is the private landowners who have fixed their fish culverts and opened up streams. It is the State Department of Transportation who is still trying to figure out where they are going to get the money. The same thing is true of forest health. So we have a big forest health problem in Washington State. We have a lot of trees that are relatively low value and low quality. And so the question is, how do you find the resources to go in and harvest those and turn them into something? And the beauty is that right here in Spokane, we have a company who's trying to lead the way in doing exactly that. So I'd like to introduce Todd Beyreuther. Close enough, he says. So he is practiced as a structural engineer in Seattle and taught at the University of Washington and the College of Built Environments. He's also a founder of Mass Timber Systems, a design, engineering, and manufacturing company here in Spokane that integrates raw timber supply and cross-laminated timber panel fabrication for high-performance buildings. His research focuses on timber structures that provide healthy and desirable buildings, while also addressing rural economic stability and forest restoration efforts for fuel reduction for wildfires. Please join me in welcoming Todd.
Thank you, Todd. That was great. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate this invitation. This is a great opportunity that I really cherish, especially locally here in Spokane. So I am here representing Katerra. I'm going to also back into this a little bit into our market-based, kind of delivery here. I want to thank Serena. I'm going to ground myself in my credentials. I'm from northern Minnesota. I'm from the red. I understand that culture. I understand Governor's Walker, his base very well. I also understand the blue. I understand, from my education at University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, from my time spent in professional practice in Seattle and at the University of Washington, those are not binaries to me in the solution. That is part of the discussion we should have. Urban densification is real, and it has to be fully integrated with the rural economic development and with the environmental solutions we're talking about here. So just to touch on a couple of those things, I'm going to back in with some of my volunteer and public hats before I get into this. This pays my This is my daily job. I believe in this. I wake up every day as a technologist, as a designer, looking for competitive advantage in the market. My volunteer and my public face that you can find, I'm an adjunct research professor at Washington State University still. I'm the president of the Plan Commission in Spokane, where we defend the Growth Management Act, we defend the urban boundaries, and we want to be part of the solution on how to densify and how to do this properly. And you see the market-based solutions here. But with that, I'm also a volunteer as a board member in the Northwest Land Conservancy. And the Land Conservancy is not an advocacy group. It is dealing with willing landowners and partners. Half or probably a majority of our willing land partners and board represent the culture that we're talking about here today of hunting and fishing. And I thought I had the credentials there until I had my first conversation with Serena, and she introduced me to bow fishing, which I'm embarrassed I didn't know about in northern Minnesota. But so in that, my point is that it's important to me, although I have a strong political bias, as everyone does, I need to knock on every door in Olympia. And I need to be able to tell this story with all of the stakeholders, and we have done that. We have done that in mass timber in Washington. It is not a partisan issue. And for example, in the recent this year, or actually in the supplemental budget about 2 years ago, supplemental session, there was I think it was 96-1 vote to move forward on trying to pass mass timber state building code changes to it for the densification of wood, but also to drive this rural economic development. So it is really cannot be a binary issue. So I'm going to get to now the Katerra message here. So Katerra is a technology company, and we like a few introductory slides here. Competitive advantage. Telecom evolved. We're looking at the scale of the industry up here, 800 billion. Between over a 56-year period. Innovation is not linear. Innovation goes in leaps, and it is about making it cost effective. So I agree very much with the statement that the environmental only happens with the economical cost parity. That's true in fuels. That we talk about liquid gas, and we talk about coal, so forth. We recently saw that shift, and the drop of lithium batteries is now going to make COA relevant. And it's not a debate. It is simply that now makes sense, and that will win. Now, it might take time, it might be so forth, but that wins. And the automotive industry evolved. And we're talking about automation, so forth. Construction has not. This is an image from 1833, and we like to play with this and say, we are essentially building buildings the same way we did for the last 1,500 years. That's not bad. We're talking about local labor, local resources, so forth, low energy inputs. But our labor industry, we have a shortage. It is a challenge, and we cannot cost effectively deal with our population growth in the way we need to. So Katerra wants to be part of the solution. In that, we are a global company, and the goal here is vertical integration from design, supply chain, all the way through to handing over the keys to a building. In that, this number should now be 5,000 with recent acquisitions. Our original focus was U.S., but we recently expanded into India, Saudi Arabia, so forth. So it really has a global intent, but the U.S. is where my focus is, and specifically on this region. How we do it, we have the supply chain, materials focus. I'm the Senior Director of Advanced Building Materials. Our goal is to create the materials, looking 6 to 12 months ahead to deliver to our design and engineering teams. So in that, we have new build projects, but we also have renovation. The renovation is important in the sense that we think about a whole life cycle. Everything we put into a building should have an end of life, whether it's 5-10 years on technology systems, HVAC, so forth, or 100 years on what my focus is on the structure. This is the building that's under construction right now on the south landing of the University District Gateway Bridge. We're very proud of this. Currently, if you've been over on Sprague, the concrete's out of the ground, and it's waiting on the timber panels that are coming out of this factory eventually. In Spokane Valley, we're building a 250,000 square foot factory for these large format CLT panels, cross-laminated timber panels. But we also focus on other typologies. That's a commercial, that's an institutional building for Eastern Washington University, and they'll have some office space above. This is student housing, which also is very similar to hospitality hotels and in the low, medium, and mid-rise and high-rise typologies that were recently passed in the model code across the U.S. and the state of Washington on a policy side. Well, those in the International Building Code, those don't come into effect until 2021. The legislature stepped in and said, we will adopt those today. In fact, we'll retroactively adopt it in the 2015 code. We'll adopt it in the 2018 code. Let's go do this in Washington. Oregon is following. California's a few years behind. So in this is about urban densification. This is mid-rise typology that's suitable for our Seattle, Portland, San Francisco markets, and some in Spokane. This is a rendering of the factory of the industrial typologies we work on. And then getting into now more of the value chain of this. Social and political capital, we take a capital approach. A lot of this work was done previously with our Washington State University partners across the four states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana. When we were looking to site this factory, this was a regional approach. You can include British Columbia with that. And what I'm proud to say is that the two locations that were most suitable for this type of advanced manufacturing and resource availability were Longview, Washington, and Spokane, Washington. And in that, I don't necessarily have a bias, but Spokane is the winner for various reasons, because of our forest availability, that the type of lamp stock that we can pull out of these forests, but also the need for restoration. So I'll get into that, but I do want to state my point about Washington, Oregon, California. Somebody has to lead on the policy side. And while these are blue states, and that is where it's happening right now, this will propagate across the country. That's not eliminating the opportunities that exist across the rest of the country, but this is where the leadership right now in the country is happening, and that's why we're here and where we focus our efforts. This is where our projects are. With our developer partners, we have a heavy West Coast focus, but are currently rapidly expanding through acquisition into the East Coast. But with this, you'll see, I like to use a resource map of our forest cover. If you were to place one of these factories, where would you do it? Well, obviously where there are trees. And then in that, orange represents this factory, red represents our target markets for urban markets. And then what's hard to see here are the gray dots that go along these three bottom dots here. We are building factories in California, Arizona, and Texas that are focused on cold form steel and light gauge steel to do 3 to 5 story buildings. In that, so it kind of represents our mass timber, where we will do commercial projects in the 12-story up to 12-story typologies, but also to integrate in components in each one of those factories. So in that, I want to talk a little bit about this bio-building cluster. So if you're in the business of making wood products, whether it's lumber or these large format panels, you also are in this advanced manufacturing. We have great examples of that in town. We have Berg Manufacturing, others that are champions that are focused on combining these two clusters, this Boeing type mentality that we have in Washington. It doesn't just exist on the west side. But then you're also in the bioenergy, the biofuels, when you're dealing with the residuals, and then you're also in dealing with forest health. And so in this, from a natural resource standpoint, one of our challenges and opportunities is that we have multiple species. This technology was developed in Europe, but we have great fiber in the slow-growing, semi-arid areas on the east side. The west side has great fiber, it's faster growing and so forth, but it's unique in terms of the properties of these specific trees, and then that's what we focus on. We have physical infrastructure. We have existing communities. We have existing mills, whether they're operating or existing, and they're very challenged right now with low lumber prices. So there is an opportunity, especially on the east side, to bring this mothballed infrastructure back online. And we have restoration. So whatever your beliefs are environmental, and I'm firmly grounded in both my professional career and my public in the public realm, that we do have climate issues. We are seeing these disturbances based for fire or for beetle or so forth. Market-based solutions are part of it, but can't be the only solution. So in that, what's the role of technology? Technology on dealing with forests has also evolved. We need to go in selectively and use data-driven solutions to thin these forests and find markets for that fiber. And so in that, different supply chains for mass timber, I show this mainly because the orange represents that vertical integration that we feel is necessary. But these other supply chains of the traditional mills, adding a value-add facility such as glulam or CLT, like we're seeing with great partners as Vaughan Timber up in Colville. We're seeing some other smaller manufacturers emerge just across the border in Canada. We need all of these to succeed and create a critical mass so that we can pull these types of logs. And if you look closely here, these are off public land. That R6 represents Region 6. These are probably off the Colville National Forest, Okanagan National Forest. And that has to be, integrated in, working with our state partners, DNR, working with the U.S. Forest Service, and working with the private landowners that are very, the small private landowners on the east side that are very much part of this story. This is a picture from Austria, but this is the ambition. We will go in and we will be able to go into the forest, selectively harvest, restore habitat, restore for wildfire suppression, fuel reduction, and be able to bring that to an advanced manufacturing mentality to bring it into a value-add product. This is what's left behind. This is also part of the story. Whether this goes to biofuels or is returned to the forest floor, there has to be a solution for this. And that often is not market-driven. It is not proven yet to be effective, but we have to find that solution together. And ultimately, we're talking about creating better living environments. This is a building that was designed for Portland, so it is not just about the building, but it is about the districts that we have, the examples we have in University District here. What's called an eco district is really an energy and combined heat and power solution, and how we use a microgrid, created by our strong leaders at Avista and others in the University District as an example for how building materials, energy, and all of these urban strategies come together. So with that, I'll thank you.
All right, so if people have questions, we have somebody with a microphone. I'll ask the first question, which is, how tall are you able to build these wood buildings now using CLT?
Yeah, thank you. Ron? So one's the technical side. Reasonably, you can go 18 to 30 stories, maybe more if you start integrating in with other materials. But I think the target, and then with the recent changes in the code that are now, as of July 1st, will be implemented in Washington, we can go up to 18 stories. But I think our target is really on wood.
Yeah, so 18 stories of just wood.
Just wood, yes.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So, all right, who has questions? Right up here, and then over here. Hang on 1 second so we can all hear you.
Am I confused, or is this a composite wood? You break the wood down and then you put it back together again as a composite, or?
Technically, yes. And unlike plywood or OSB that would use a veneer or a strand and then compress it, densify, we call it, this is using something that looks a lot like lumber. And it's simply sawn, and then we cross layers, 3 or 5 layers, and those can be floors or walls. And the factory we're building can make a 60-foot by 12-foot by 1-foot deep panel.
So my question is then, how does that affect the environment when you're taking the wood apart and then putting it back together? I mean, are you ending up having more cost to the environment because you are doing that? That's my question.
It's a great question, and the simple answer, because there's complexity to it, but the sawn product has a lot less energy input than, say, a densified product, and that's not a statement against densified plywood or OSB or so forth. But I think my opinion is when we think about carbon, I think the statement was made earlier that carbon essentially equals cost. So however you want to look at it, more carbon equals more cost, more energy equals more carbon, so forth. So if we can do a lower energy product, great for us, right? Whether that's compared to concrete, steel, so forth, it's a really that kind of.
And the other thing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can also use timber that would be lower quality, that would be harder, and you can turn it into something more usable. Is that correct?
You know, the Canadians have done a great job of yes, it's true. Although I think I tend to spin that a little bit and say we have the capability with our strong mill partners in this area in particular, on the Washington side and the Idaho side, that we can use technology to be very specific about the way we cut it. So it's kind of irrelevant, it's low quality or high quality, it's really, it's the right quality.
Question.
The biomass, the slash that's left over, what are some of the solutions for that?
It's one of the biggest challenges because right now, often it's burned in the spring when there's low wildfire threat. And that's obviously not a great solution, but we have to get that biomass out of there. So it's a challenge. And there are a lot of great public-private partnerships that are looking at trying to convert it to pellets or fuels or other types. And so there's no silver bullet. It's really kind of all of the above. And I think that's an important piece. I think, you would never be simply in the oil business. If you're in the oil business, you're in plastics, you're doing all sorts of co-products that are secondary markets for.
So there's a couple of things. One is that there is hope for what's called cellulosic ethanol. And cellulosic ethanol uses that type of leftover wood and corn stalks and other things like that, as opposed to corn and sugar cane that we typically think of as ethanol. And so they're working on technology to be able to use that in an efficient, economical way. University of Washington is working on it amongst others, and the problem is that one of the researchers said cellulosic ethanol is always 5 years away. So when I was at the Department of Natural Resources, we were talking about taking some of that slash and turning it into some kind of energy source or something else. The other problem is that because it's very low quality, the transportation costs of getting it out of the forest to where you can process it in a usable form is also very high compared to other things. But, as you said, it's something that people are looking at. It's a resource that is literally laying there waiting for somebody to come up with a use for it, and so they're working on it. Other questions in the back here?
Yes, just had at our Lincoln Day dinner had a presentation by Russ Vaughan. We are dairy owners from up in Colville. And I see in agriculture a certain requirement for a social license to really exist, to produce food to feed the nation and to feed the world. And so we invest in enormous cutting-edge technologies to really be ahead of the curve and do great things. And that's what I really saw in this presentation with Vaughan's. In addition to that, with their chip mill, we're working together with agriculture in an operation that it actually sanitizes waste from dairies into drinking water and irrigation water for livestock. And we use chips from the chip mill in Vaughan's. So it's a real integration. We're very, very involved in ag in the classroom presentations in high school, and recently did about presentation to a couple thousand students over the course of the year. And having said that, one of the key issues I asked them was, what is a renewable resource? Specifically speaking with food and fiber, trees being the fiber. And teachers and students had no idea what a renewable resource was. If I asked, what is a clear cut? Every one of them knew. And so with this technology that's so amazing, and it's really cutting edge and clean up our timber in our state and in the Pacific Northwest, what are we doing to give us a social license to continue to be able to utilize the renewable resource of harvesting trees?
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a great both summary, but also relevant question in the sense that Russ Vaughan and his father Dwayne couldn't be bigger champions in this area, and understanding forest restoration, but also understanding the economics and their survival in the 80s with certain changes, and looking towards technology to solve that economic piece, but then also to lead in terms of establishing a social license. And when I say we need to be able to knock on any door in Olympia, most of those doors were knocked on by Russ and me together, a few years ago. And it's really in that we've seen this change in the last couple of years. I happen to be at this event because of our involvement with another land conservancy, which has evolved into a larger group in Forterra, which is a very progressive group of looking at that urban-rural, balance and how they can look at both of those challenges together and bringing a coalition together, bipartisan coalitions together. And it's really that type of approach that we're doing on the west side with groups led by Forterra, the northeast, I think they call it the coalition that Russ and his father are leading with environmental groups and loggers and so forth in the northeast. Those are two great examples on each side of the mountain are creating that social license and improving it.
And you talk about social license. We had an event last month in the Tri-Cities with our young professionals with the head of the Yakima tribe timber program. And they don't have complete autonomy to do what they want. They have still regulations that have to do with the federal government. But if you look at a map of healthy forests in the eastern slope of the Cascades, going from north to south, you will see unhealthy, watershed by watershed, unhealthy, healthy, unhealthy. And the healthy is the Yakima tribe, because they built a mill and they said, we've got to go do something about our forest. And because they have a little bit more freedom to do what they want because they are a tribe, they went in there and got that, created jobs. And now when you look at that map, it's very stark. There is an outline of the Yakima reservation, and the forests are much more healthy. It is that social license. They got to make the decision, this is good for us in our forests, and they did it. So a couple more questions right back here.
Thank you very much to both of you guys for presenting. Serena, I've got a question for you. I'm a active Eastern Washington hunter and took my hunter safety when I was 13 in Chelan, Washington. Didn't know anything that you were talking about how the funding tracks down, and I think that's fascinating. Especially in our state, given that we've got amazing mountains and the whole Cascade Range, is there an equivalent funding vehicle, or has there been any discussion for backpackers, climbers, kayakers, other user groups that benefit from our conserved lands? And if not, would you lead that effort?
Well done. There have been some efforts to kind of streamline and update Pittman-Robertson. Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. There have been some efforts to kind of streamline and update Pittman-Robertson to do exactly what it is that you're talking about, and whether it's I know there's been some attention to hiking boots. There's been some attention to binoculars, because whether you're a hunter or a bird watcher, you're going to need a really nice pair of Swarovskis, right? So, but I don't know how much traction those get. I think that there might be, I shouldn't speculate, but I suspect that there might be some reluctance to play with Pittman-Robertson too much because you don't want to mess with a good thing. But there are some folks that are kind of looking at, how can we get a little bit more from some of these user groups that are reaping the public benefit, but not necessarily going to go out and buy a firearm. So yeah, that's to answer your question sort of vaguely. There are some efforts, but I don't want to get to this one.
I don't think she answered the second part of your question. JT, you get the last question.
No, I'm giving you the answer to that one, actually. Everyone here knows Representative Joel Kretz, represents the 7th District. He proposed something this year that we nicknamed the spandex tax. It was designed to let those people that are probably all really great environmentalists but don't have to pay their fair share, and only on the most expensive outdoor non-gun pieces of equipment pay their fair share. And it didn't get very far and was opposed by a lot of downtown retailers.
All right, and on that note, we are out of time, so please join me in thanking very much our guest speakers.